when the fishing is really good, you can have a lot of fun by fishing a long whip. This one I've got here set today is 6 meters to hand. With just a simple 3 gram rig, I can get to the fish really quickly. But it also means a slightly different way of feeding. Because you're fishing with a set measurement of line, unlike a stick float, it's very important to get the fish feeding straight in front of you. And one of the best ways you can do that is by introducing ground bait. Laced with bait, casters, hemp and maggots. A ball of ground bait, quite sticky so it holds all them particles, introduced into the peg, can really pay dividends. There's a couple of kind of whips that people use. You could either use the traditional flick tip style, or as I'm using today, I've got an elasticator whip. That means about the last foot has got a short length of elastic as a shock absorber for if you hook any decent fish. We've had chub up to like 10 or 12 ounce today doing this, so it just gives you that little bit more reassurance when you do hook a big fish that it's not going to run off and pull the hook out or even break your hook length. One of the things you've got to do, you've got to keep the fish coming, so it's really important to keep feeding. You've got it, like I say, because you're fishing a whip, you've only got a limited amount of line and a limited amount of space that you can get down your swim, so it's really important to keep the bait going in and to keep in touch with the fish. Long whip fishing has been around for many years. Used to use it quite a lot in Ireland when there was big weights of roach to be had, but over the last few years it seemed to have been like a forgotten method. And then you come onto the River Wye, which is there's so many fish in here, it's unbelievable. You go on the River Wye and it's definitely something that you need in your armoury. Like I say, it's like a forgotten method, but on its day it is totally unbeatable because you've got all the fish, you're feeding very positive, you've got all the fish straight in front of you, and it's a real good way of building a very big weight. The actual size of the fish that are in the Wye at the moment are absolutely outrageous. If you're unlucky enough to catch a 4 ounce fish, the next chuck you'll be wanting an 8 ounce one. There's so many different species as well. Predominantly dace, but like I say, we've had dace up to 8 and 10 ounce, real specimens. Chub up to 10 and 12 ounce. And roach up to a pound. So you really don't know what it's going to be. When the float goes under, you really don't know what it's going to be next. When targeting these big weights on rivers, using the whip, you need quite sturdy gear. It's only 6 foot deep, but I've got a 3 gram rig on, and I need it to get down pretty quick to where the fish are feeding. So main line is 0.20 or 6 pound. Hook length 0.14 and a size 14 hook. Probably don't seem as extreme as you might think, but you still have to have a little bit of finesse. You can't just put a massive hook on and expect to catch nice roach and quality fish. So it is quite a positive approach, but you still need a little bit of the air of finesse. Ground bait wise, you don't need anything too spectacular. I've got 4 kilos of ground bait, nice and sweet ground bait, and 2 kilos of soil added. That's just normal molehill soil, sieved off, which gives it a nice texture so you can squeeze a ball up, because inside here we've got maggots, we've got casters, and we've got a lot of hemp. You do need to keep these fish happy and fed. If you don't keep them fed, they will swim off and find food elsewhere. So it's really important to have your ground bait nice and sticky, and like I say, adding the soil makes it heavier as well, so it gets down to the bottom where you need to be catching these fish. It's really important to keep in touch with the fish. That's why on these sessions I like to have a stick float and a whip set up. When you're catching them on the whip, it's real good fun, but sometimes they do start to move about, the fish, and that's where the stick float can come in again. It helps you to search your swim and find where the fish are. Fish do have a tend to move up and down. In here there's a few predators. We've had a nice big pike in front of us for half of the day, which definitely disturbs the fish. So if the fish move out a little bit, and like I've said, the whip has only got a small range. You can only fish in a certain amount of water because of the fixed line and the fixed length of pole. So if you stop getting bites, keep on feeding, and it don't do any harm just to cast the stick float over the top and go further down your peg, just to see if the fish have dropped down. But one of the key features, as I've said, is you've got to keep feeding. These fish are really hungry. Little and often is always the best feeding tactic. With having just a set length of line on the whip, feeding is always key. As you're looking at a clock face, if 12 o'clock is straight in front, I like to put my ground bait in at 1 o'clock. Because it's hard and it goes straight to the bottom, I want it to break up straight away, and that means it lays a nice bed going down. I don't want to put my ground bait too far downstream, otherwise I'll run out of line. So you've got to select an area, what I call the killing zone, where you need to feed and catch your fish over the top of your feed. That's how you get the best out of these whip sessions. So feeding, where you put your feed, is absolutely vital. Depending on the depth of your peg, you can have a good session on the whip and loose feeding. I'd be very, very cautious if it's quite a deep peg and you're loose feeding maggots. As I've mentioned before, with the whip, you've got to be quick, you've got to be in and out, and you need to be catching the fish straight in front of you. Obviously, loose feeding maggots is an absolute brilliant way to draw fish into your peg, but I'd be a little bit skeptical if it's quite deep of actually feeding too many maggots, otherwise the fish will follow them. Don't do any harm to just flick a few in though, just to create a trail downstream, and hopefully the fish will follow them into the ground bait. See that fish? If you look into its mouth, it's absolutely full of ground bait, hemp, casters and maggots, which means that they're right on top of the feed, which is really important when whip fishing. One of the questions is, what kind of float would you use for whip fishing? Again, depending on depth and flow, if it's not flowing too fast and it's a decent depth, a pencil float can be just as good as anything, the traditional whip pencil float. But one of the methods that does work well on the Wye, in the shallower pegs, is actually fishing a stick float on a whip, because you get a different kind of presentation. One of the important things is, when whip fishing, is keep everything nice and to hand. It is a quick method which you can catch really big weights, but you've got to be prepared to put in the hard work, and it is quite exhausting. The system is lay the float in, always a nice ball into the selected area where the fish are, and then what I like to do is get another ball ready in my ground bait bucket for when I catch the next fish. It's so important. You don't have to be fast. More efficient is probably a better word. So you're getting a nice rhythm. You're getting a nice rhythm and you're not rushing around. You get less tangles and definitely put more fish in the net. The setup couldn't be simpler. Got my bucket ring here. Keep net right between my legs in case any fish drop off. When you're catching quality fish, they do have the odd one does actually fall off. Nice big quality dace like that. On the left hand side, I've got my maggots and some hemp seed. So I never take the whip out of my hand. If you notice, whether I'm feeding, unhooking a fish, rebaiting, the whip is never out my hands. So nice little swing out. Ball of ground bait I've already made. Into the swim. Get another ball ready for the next time you think you need to feed. Missed a bite then. And just repeat the process. It's just like I said before, it's not about being fast, it's just about being efficient. If you start rushing around and windmilling, that's when you can get tangles and make mistakes, and you end up spending more time out of the water than actually fishing in the water. It's so important to have everything to hand. You don't want to be reaching around trying to get hold of something. But if you think that something isn't in the right place, don't hesitate to stop fishing and make sure you get everything right. There you go, there's a nice roach there. And say the whip never leaves my hand. So I'll rebait up. The rig goes straight in the water. The ball of ground bait already I've made up, introduced into the swim. And then I'll make another one up, ready for the next time. For a nice session, as you've seen, you don't need a lot. A bucket of ground bait, some hemp and a few maggots, a couple of positive rigs. Brilliant for short sessions in the winter. You keep really nice and warm because the action is so frantic. But obviously one of the key things is you need to pick the right venues. And the River Wye doesn't disappoint.